The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
After President Obama's State of the Union speech earlier this week, we discussed how great many of the ideas he mentioned were, but how unlikely they were to succeed. And what's fascinating is that we think we have a system where our elected officials represent the wills and legislative desires of the constituents. But as I've mentioned to you many times, we do not. And we have a new poll which shows us that in spite of the fact that the Republican-controlled House and Senate are very unlikely to actually allow or even explore passing some of the ideas President Obama proposed, all of his proposals were very, very popular with actual Americans. Minimum wage. We now have, I guess, 2 or maybe even 3 State of the Union addresses where President Obama talked a lot about minimum wage and working salaries and living wages, etc. And in spite of the fact that so many states have opted not to pass minimum wage increases and that we see such opposition federally to an increase in the federal minimum wage, a 2014 poll found that 73% of Americans actually favor raising the federal minimum wage to $10.10 per hour. On education, a recent poll found that Americans support President Obama's subsidized community college proposal by 53 to 44. Not overwhelming support, but still a 9-point margin in favor. Gun reform. President Obama has tried to prioritize gun reform. Congress has repeatedly rejected legislation that would even support stricter background checks, in spite of the fact that a recent poll shows that 79% or more of all Americans support stricter gun background checks. 85% of Americans thought that all gun purchasers, even at private gun shows, should have to pass a background check. We couldn't get that through Congress. On tax reform, polling shows that Americans support increasing taxes on the rich by a 2-to-1 margin. No chance, Lewis, no chance whatsoever of passing a Republican House and Senate. On climate change, we see, as I told you, 72% of Senate Republicans are climate deniers to some extent, although polls show that 72% of Americans support more pollution controls, 70% of Americans want more wildlife refuges protected, and 66% of Americans believe that we should be expanding renewable sources of energy. Tough to get traction. And on immigration, 52 to 44 Americans support President Obama's executive action on immigration. Almost no Republicans support it at all. So again, a total disconnect between what those who are voting want and what those who are voted in choose to pursue.
I don't know why they think that. I think they have this idea that you are elected, so the people chose you because they like your ideas and they like what you have to say about things and they want you to do things the way you would. But clearly, there are some big differences here between what the voters want and what the officials want.
It almost seems like this silly romantic notion that our elected officials might actually do what the constituents want rather than what lobbyists or their biggest donors or corporations want them to do. I guess I'm just a hopeless romantic, Lewis. I still imagine that maybe our elected officials would do what the constituents want.
Maybe one day, maybe if we fix money in politics and perhaps expand the number of the members of Congress, I don't know.
Republicans posted a completely doctored and modified version of President Obama's State of the Union speech, and then I will tell you what their explanation was. It's a laughably ridiculous explanation. The official website for the House Republicans posted a YouTube version of President Obama's State of the Union address, and it had kind of like a running commentary on the side of the screen where it would give instant fact checks of some of the things President Obama said. And they completely removed that entire section where President Obama was criticizing the Republican non-scientific rhetoric on climate change. And it was about at the 43-ish minute mark. And this was called an enhanced webcast by Republicans. But really, I think it was quite the opposite, since it removed pieces of the speech altogether. President Obama talked about how some Republicans go back to this "I'm not a scientist" thing. And he took that head on. He presented facts about climate science and what actual scientists think. And that entire section was completely missing. Republicans are saying, and this is just so funny, that the edits weren't intentional. They said, according to John Boehner's press secretary, Michael Steele, he said, the video edits were not intentionally made. It was inadvertent. We are working with YouTube to figure out what happened. This is so insane. And we work with YouTube every single day, and we know how this works. You can go in and you can trim a video after you've uploaded it to YouTube. But the idea that they uploaded this 1 hour speech and perfectly edited out sections happen to disappear along with any reference to them is just so ridiculous. I wonder if they actually followed through and emailed YouTube and said, listen, we posted this entire thing, and somehow these sections, which happen to be really inconvenient for us, were removed. Can you explain what kind of YouTube glitch might have caused this? I mean, it's laughably ridiculous.
Yes, I think the odds of something like this happening inadvertently would be, and I've heard people use this example before, like being struck by lightning while being eaten by a shark.
Right.
It's, maybe even more slim than that. It just doesn't happen. That's a flat out lie. It's complete bull.
Do you think that Republicans at any point will just admit that what I think they would be better off doing is admitting that some rogue intern decided to do this on their own? Maybe even the best story would be it was a liberal plant who interned with Boehner under the guise of being a good intern, but actually was there to cause chaos. And they edited these sections out in order to make Republicans look bad. That would be far more believable than the story they've come up with.
It would be. Don't give them any ideas. We don't need them having that as their excuse now. It wouldn't surprise me.
This is really funny. Before the State of the Union address, the White House organized a media lunch, and they had little place cards for the different journalists for where they would be sitting. And I will just let Fox News' Shepard Smith, or maybe I should call him Fox's Shepard Smith, explain to you what happened.
So, White House, if you're watching, I thank you for the lunch again. It was really delicious. My only regret is that I didn't have the wine. I sat next to Brian Williams, and we all have these place cards, and his said Brian Williams, NBC News. And across from me was David Muir, the new guy on ABC. It said David Muir, ABC News. And then over next to the president was Scott Pelley, and it said Scott Pelley, ABC News. And I looked at mine, and it doesn't say anything about news. It just says Fox. And I looked at Brett Baer's, and it said Brett Baer Fox. But all the rest of them got news. I mean, I don't care. Lunch was great. But I guess there's a message received. But I think Brett and I are good to go with the news part. And I think you know that too.
We've talked about this before, Lewis. News is not a regulated word. You can call yourself Fox News or Lewis News or whatever you want without any analysis being done as to whether you're presenting news or infotainment or entertainment. This is kind of like when a product says, this is an all-natural food. It's very different than saying this is USDA certified organic. Natural is not a regulated word. News is not a regulated word in television. And the cards that the White House put out there are actually pretty accurate.
I love this. I think perhaps maybe we should start doing this. How about from now on, when we refer to Fox News or when we type in Fox News, we leave out the news part? Why not?
Well, I think Tom Hartman has started saying Fox so-called news. I don't know if he still does it, but there was a while where every time he would refer to it that way.
Well, I love this. I hope that Obama had a hand in this shenanigan because it's sending a very clear message.
Don't forget, though, that after losing a lawsuit by two correspondents who were fired for refusing to add distortions to their stories, Fox actually appealed the decision with the argument that their news is actually entertainment and that they have no obligation to tell the truth. And that has actually been verified. In other words, courts agree that it is not illegal for a station that calls itself a news station to say things that are not actual news, but rather fabrications or concoctions or distortions. So Fox has gone to court over the fact that calling them Fox rather than Fox News is more empirically accurate.
Or we could always just put news in quotes. There is, of course, a difference between the regular Fox network and the actual Fox News station. So I guess we still, in some ways, need to clarify.
Republican Senator Joni Ernst, as you probably have heard me mention, both grew up castrating hogs on a farm and gave the response to President Obama's State of the Union address on Tuesday evening. Now, I call it a response because it was not actually a rebuttal. She did not rebut almost anything that President Obama said. She merely spoke in a time slot that made it seem as though her speech was in some way directly related to President Obama's. When it came to subject matter, there was very little in common. But something very interesting that did come out of Joni Ernst's speech is that in the speech, as many Republicans do, Joni Ernst called for cuts in government spending. She described how her views grew out of her own simple upbringing that didn't depend on government subsidies or government support. And she talks about her family watching every penny. And at one point, she only had one pair of shoes, Lewis. But an investigation of public records by the Washington, D.C.-based District Sentinel found that between 1995 and 2009, Joni Ernst's family received almost $500,000 in government handouts and payments targeted towards government subsidy of farms with taxpayer funding. Yet another glaring double standard from so-called small government anti-welfare conservatives who were personally or by their direct families beneficiaries of a lack of government, small government conservatism, as they would describe it, of course. The District Sentinel showed that Joni Ernst's own father, Richard Culver, received almost $40,000 in taxpayer handouts, most of it going to corn subsidies. And Joni Ernst's uncle, Dallas Culver, soaked up almost $370,000 in federal agriculture subsidies. All told, $460,000. Ernst, by the way, this was probably just an innocent oversight, Lewis, failed to mention her own family's reliance on government handouts when criticizing government handouts.
I think her counter argument would probably be something along the lines of, well, this is for farming. You know, we are hardworking people. We are providing food for others. And so these subsidies make sense for us. And the handouts she'd probably say she's against are people who, poor people, inner city people, urban people, if you will, who don't work and don't do anything and just want the government to give them money.
Are you talking about blah people, Lewis? Is that who you're referring
people.
to?
Yeah, blah people.
Corporate media just spooning this stuff up. I mean, they were just loving it. CNN talked about Ernst's hard scrabble upbringing. NBC News talked about how Joni Ernst brushed aside the president's call for higher taxes, vowing that Republicans would cut wasteful spending. I wonder if the $500,000 her family received would be part of that wasteful spending. And we'll see if any corporate media actually reports on the fact that this is just another glaring double standard from so-called fiscal conservatives. We will take a break. We have a great program for you today. Twitter.com/dpacman. Follow me on Twitter.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to The David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show is funded mostly through our membership program at davidpakman.com/membership. Today's new member of the day is Melissa Klein, and it just so happens that Melissa Klein is member of the day on the same day that James Varnum enters the David Pakman Show Membership Hall of Fame. James has spent 4 years with us, and James now qualifies for a free David Pakman Show apparel item, zip-up, pullover hoodie, a t-shirt, whatever James wants. Just let us know. We will get that sent out to you. And you can start on the path to Hall of Famedom by going to davidpakman.com/membership, and you will get all of our great member benefits, including a whole other show called The Bonus Show that is just for members. davidpakman.com/membership. I have a great documentary recommendation for you today. It is a documentary called Dear Zachary. And the full name of the film is Dear Zachary, a letter to a son about his father. I don't even know how to present the film, Lewis, without giving away parts that if people don't know the story would be best for them to see in the film, you know?
Yeah, I would say that I've watched it. It is fascinating, and we should talk about it as little as possible. But it is an incredible documentary, a very low budget documentary, but very well done, very sad.
Can we say it's a story about murder? I don't even want to say. I don't even want to put the word A in front of it. Just it's a story about murder. It's
a story about murder and about family and about friends, and partially about legal battles and the legal system and the differences between the Canadian system and what's going on up there and perhaps ours.
Can we say it's a movie about mental illness also?
Oh, definitely. Yes, there is mental illness.
So we're talking here about Dear Zachary, a letter to a son about his father. It is on Netflix. It is pretty widely available elsewhere as well. I highly recommend it. I don't want to say too much because I don't want to. Spoil is not even the right term. We're not talking about, a fantasy or action story here, but I don't want to give away some of the key elements of this horrible story that is told in Dear Zachary. But I couldn't recommend it more highly, Lewis.
Agreed. Yeah, just watch it and then let it unfold. It's an incredible piece of work.
We told you about the number of anti-abortion bills that this new Republican majority in the Senate has started to work on since they took over just a week or two ago. And we also told you that some Republican women were starting to get a little bit skittish about pushing through this legislation, these anti-abortion bills, including one that would ban all abortions beyond 20 weeks. And that has now turned into Republicans abruptly dropping one of their anti-abortion bills. The original legislation banned all abortion after 20 weeks of pregnancy. And the language that caused the chaos was that it required women to report sexual assault if they wanted to have a rape exemption for being allowed to have an abortion after 20 weeks. And many elected officials, mostly Democrats, but some Republican women said, wait a second, we already have huge stigma around the reporting of rape. And the last thing we're going to do now is create a situation where women choose to have a back alley abortion because they haven't reported the rape for any of the reasons that women may not report rape. And now they can't have a legal abortion. This is just too much. And indeed, Republicans have abruptly killed this bill. And that's the right move, Lewis. And it's kind of shocking that it took so long to get to the point where some women on the Republican side realized that this has just gone too far.
I'm still surprised at how quickly they dropped this. Do you think that perhaps some of these Republicans just knew that this would not fly, that this would not pass, and did it anyway just so they could point to it and say, look, well, we tried?
I don't know. I mean, Republicans Tom Cole and Trent Franks said that they did consider changing the rape language to placate the objecting members, but that they were worried that if they softened the rape language, it would alienate the more extreme right-wingers, which is this tells you how insane the Republican Party is right now, that rather than create a bill that doesn't completely throw women who are already victims of sexual assault under the bus, rather than just fix that problem, they said we should scrap this altogether because otherwise the loony right of our party is going to flip out at us that we're being too soft about abortion.
If you're aware that there is that loony element to your party, I mean, shouldn't you just kind of side with the people who are a bit more reasonable and not as crazy?
Well,
that just makes sense.
The thing is that you need the extreme right to raise the money. So it's not so simple. You can't just write them off, Lewis.
Well, no, I guess not. It's a complicated game these politicians play.
In Montana, we have had a pipeline oil spill, which I know this is going to sound familiar, again, makes it so that residents should not drink the water. Montana officials say that an oil pipeline breached, spilling about 50,000 gallons of oil into the Yellowstone River. They said they are unaware of threats to public safety or health, but at the same time, because some of the oil did get into the water, residents were told not to drink any tap water, which is smelling like diesel. If I had to choose, Lewis, between the licorice water in West Virginia and the diesel water in Montana, I would prefer on smell alone the licorice water, although it sounds like the licorice water was more harmful because you didn't even want that touching your skin, whereas you're just being told not to drink the diesel water.
I think I would have to pick the diesel water. And, if I had my way, of course, none of the above. But now there are lots of people who don't really have a choice.
Bridger Pipeline Company said in the statement that it shut down the 10-inch wide pipeline shortly before 11 a.m. Saturday. They said, quote, "Our primary concern is to minimize the environmental impact of the release and keep our responders safe as we clean up from this unfortunate incident." It's so hard for me to believe that the number one concern for these pipeline companies is minimizing the environmental impact of the spill when the entire concept of the fuel that they are pipelining from one place to another is harmful to the environment.
The primary concern is to minimize the fiscal impact on their company. That's always the primary goal, no matter what.
An ExxonMobil pipeline broke near Laurel, Montana during flooding back in July of 2011, and it released 63,000 gallons of oil, which washed up along an 85-mile stretch of riverbank. And you often hear the position from the drill baby drill people when you hear about a spill, especially when you talk about the spill in terms of gallons, is to say, you're doing left-wing spin because the number of gallons is always higher than the number of barrels, and it makes it sound way worse. When you think about an 85-mile stretch of riverbank, which has this oil sediment on it, the impact of that is huge. And whether you talk about it in terms of gallons or in terms of barrels or in terms of milliliters or whatever you want, 85 miles of riverbank being impacted by a spill is a huge thing. And we need to be moving away from these pipelines. We need to be moving away from fossil fuels. No Keystone XL. Fortunately, President Obama has said he would veto that. This is just all wrong.
He said he would veto it, but this is going to be a big bargaining tool for the Republicans. If there is something Obama wants done, he may need to pass the Keystone XL.
You think so? I mean, well, we also talked about the possibility that House and Senate could circumvent President Obama on Keystone XL if they were able to do sort of legislative move that we discussed. And I really hope that this does not happen because it would just be an absolute disaster. And think for a second about the fact that when we think about oil companies, these are some of the wealthiest businesses in the world. You would think that they would have the desire and the resources to construct the highest quality facilities and pipelines to transport their product, and that they would be completely foolproof. But no, oil spill after oil spill. If even the wealthiest companies can't get it together to really foolproof what we have going on here, then that means we just have a problem with the system. We have a problem with this period, and it's just more reason that we should be moving away from it.
Without the strictest oversight, these companies are going to cut corners every possible way. So this is not going to end.
No question about it. Let's take a break. We have a great interview coming up here and much more, including emails reacting to our commentary on American Sniper, the movie.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Todd Wolfson, who's an assistant professor at Rutgers University, co-founder of the Media Mobilizing Project, and also author of the book Digital Rebellion, The Birth of the Cyber Left. This is a really interesting topic, Todd, and I'm curious to start with, do you think that there is a sort of cyber right, or is there something about the internet that is inherently conducive to being used for more progressive causes?
That's a fantastic question, and it's really great to have a chance to talk to you, David. I do think there's something conducive to a progressive movement and the internet, at least, I mean, with a lot of caveats, but the conduciveness is that the internet, as it was developed, has, and as many people mark, has a democratic, participatory nature, which plays very well to both traditional progressive positions and certainly, as we see with things like General Assemblies in the Occupy movement, very much show a parallelism to the contemporary left, or what I'm calling the cyber left. So there is a cyber right. I don't think it's as developed. I think this emerges out of a particular logic, which is much more conducive to a certain form of left-based organizing.
And sometimes we see that come through in particular campaigns. I mean, I remember during the 2008 presidential campaign, John McCain's campaign's use of the internet was just a disaster. And as someone who was kind of engaged with both campaigns as a journalist to see how they each used the tools the internet provided, there was just no comparison at all to the way that President Obama was using it. What's your thought, though, about the kind of anti-net neutrality movement? Because when we step back, the internet to me seems inherently kind of like, as you said, a democratic and even sort of libertarian space, so to speak. And the anti-net neutrality movement seems to me like it would fundamentally change what the internet is.
It definitely would, and obviously net neutrality is a critical policy battle that we have in front of us. It looks things are looking better today than they did maybe 6 months ago, with the president being a strong proponent, and hopefully that impacting how the FCC chair and the FCC itself acts on this. So I don't know well what's going to happen. Obviously, none of us do, but I do think that having strong net neutrality rules is critical to the sort of left progressive movement that we've seen emerge. And so hopefully it will continue to, and I think you saw, in response to SOPA and PIPA, in response to certain sorts of moves on the around technology policy, that you've seen a certain sort of progressive movement respond to it in a very powerful way. So I think what we've seen is a certain sort of progressive movement develop around net neutrality, but a much broader progressive movement that has a stake in it.
You talk in your book about what you describe as getting sort of lost in cyberspace. And this is something that I've considered a little bit when we talk about groups like Anonymous and their activism, or even a lot of what goes on under the Gamergate hashtag online, which is that sometimes online activism, if it exists only online, can get kind of disconnected from the real world, so to speak, and the way in which people interact offline. Talk about that a little bit. How have you observed that?
Yeah, I mean, this comes out of my research on the indie media movement, which, developed in the late 90s, 99, and was really strong in the mid 2000s. And what I saw in that movement was a desire, and I would say this is based on the class position of those who were primarily in the lead of indie media, at least in the US, which I mean to say they were largely middle class, white, college educated. They had technological proficiency, amongst other things. Maybe they had journalistic backgrounds, maybe they had organizing and activist backgrounds. But they tended to see technology as the solution. So instead of taking technology and embedding it in local struggles, they really worked hard to create really important technological tools. So the indie media websites of 1999 through the early 2000s, I would argue, prefigure Facebook, prefigure Twitter, prefigure the blogging movement. And in fact, one of the programmers that was involved in indie media was one of the programmers involved in the early stages of Twitter. So the technology and what they figured out there is quite impressive. But I would argue it comes at the expense of being embedded in strong local communities. The best independent media centers that developed in that movement were ones that were embedded in the community, and those were few and far between. And I think that's a broader emergent logic of contemporary activism. It's a problem, right? And so one that we need to struggle against, and one that we need to find corrective measures for.
Do you think that there are some venues, and maybe the internet is one of them, that simply doesn't lend itself as well to conservative ideology? And I'll give you a couple of examples. Sure. In the midst of the success of The Daily Show, and I think maybe it predated the Colbert Report, but maybe around the same time, Fox News wanted to do a conservative half-hour satirical news show, and they called it the Half-Hour News Hour, and it was a disaster. I mean, it was just a complete disaster, and that started making people think maybe there's something about this type of satire that just doesn't work with conservative ideology. Is internet activism something that you would consider similar to that? In other words, is there something about the internet and conservative ideology that will not work together, or has the right simply not figured it out yet?
I would say there's no absolutes here. I think that the internet is more conducive to a broadly understood progressive politic. But I do think that the right, as the internet changes, as it becomes more corporatized, as the spaces become, as we go back to the net neutrality ruling, as these spaces become more dominated by certain interests, I do think you're going to see development of very strong right trajectory-based movements through the internet. But I think what you're arguing is very, very interesting. Yes, something like The Daily Show is something that plays very well to progressive politic, and that on the converse, something like AM talk radio tends to play more strongly to a conservative politic, and I think that there's a logic and set of practices, problems, and communities of interest that these movements or these programs speak to that make them more conducive to a certain political vision.
I'll remind the audience, the book is Digital Rebellion, The Birth of the Cyber Left. We're speaking with the author, Todd Wolfson. One of the last things I want to talk about with you, Todd, and this is kind of a big thing, is you talk in the book about horizontalism and this idea that often these progressive online movements, and sometimes, even Occupy, which was not an online movement, have a lack of a specific leader. Now, some tout that lack of a specific leader as a good thing. It's democratic. It doesn't allow individuals to sabotage or hold hostage the mission for their own personal gain. But at the same time, it has led to some problems as well, where anybody can sort of wrap themselves with the hashtag or the name of the movement and distract or distort what the message is, and it can often lead to lack of clarity. How can we suss out whether the fact that the internet provides a platform for leaderless movements, is that a positive or negative thing net?
Net, I would say it tracks these days a little bit negative. I think, obviously, this is something to be held in balance. When we look at Occupy or Indie Media, two very horizontal formations, what we see that's so important about what they do is that the horizontalism, the self-organizing aspect, the lack of a centralized structure allows for great growth. Both Indie Media and Occupy grew and developed very quickly and powerfully. A couple things that they don't do. One, they tend to, again, favor the leadership of people with the most social and cultural capital. So when you think about Indie Media or even Occupy, what you don't see is people who have who are the most oppressed, people of color, poor people, immigrants. It's very difficult for them to take the same sort of leadership that white college-educated males generally tend to be able to take, because the invisible structures of power that exist in these sorts of formations tend to dominate, and those favor people who have more social and cultural capital. So an imbalance, I think that's a problem. So I think there are good things about it. It lets us build a sense of identity with the movement when it's deeply democratic. But we have to think about building leaders, actually, I would argue, in these movements. And we may say we want to build 1,000 leaders, but leaderlessness doesn't make sense to me. What makes sense is working with communities that are oppressed and creating political education programs so that we build a clarity, connectedness, competency, and vision of the kind of world we want to create. And horizontality doesn't lend itself to those sorts of politics generally.
We've been speaking with Professor Todd Wolfson. The book is Digital Rebellion, The Birth of the Cyber Left. Very interesting and timely topic, Todd. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, David. I really appreciate it.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
A 9-month-old boy was shot and killed by his 5-year-old brother in a Missouri home earlier this week. The boy found his grandfather's .22 caliber Magnum revolver, which was being kept on a shelf built into the headboard of the master bedroom, according to Sheriff Darren White. The baby was in a crib in the same room when the gun went off and a bullet struck him in the head. White said of the gun, it was just lying out. Little kids are curious. It was in the headboard of the bed and he found it. The children, their mother, and 2 other siblings were reportedly staying in their grandfather's home in Elmo, Missouri, according to a neighbor. White said it is unclear whether they lived in the home or were just visiting. The mother, Alexis Widerholt, was in the kitchen when she heard a loud noise, sounded like a gunshot, went into the living room, found 3 of her 4 children, including the 5-year-old. Another child was playing with a paintball gun. Terrific. Her 4th child, the 9-month-old baby boy, was in the master bedroom. Police arrived to find the 9-month-old suffering from a gunshot wound to the head with the .22 caliber gun nearby. Police have no reason to think that the shooting was anything other than accidental, but it is under investigation. Well, yes, it was an accident caused by negligence on the part of the grandfather, who is presumably legally responsible for the gun, right? I mean, we have yet another case where police just go to this, hey, it was just an accident. There is no such thing as an accident in the legal sense. We should be talking here about proper, justifiable use of guns, legal use of guns, or negligence with regard to the firearm that leads to a negligent shooting. And it's time and time again the case that there are just never any charges.
I think there can be accidents. Let's say there is an altercation on the street between a police officer and a violent criminal. That criminal holds up a gun at a police officer and starts shooting. The police officer fires back, but his first bullet goes over the shoulder of that guy through the window of a house and hits and kills someone. All right, that's an accident. And the cop was just doing his job. But these situations, you're right, complete negligence. And I think there should be charges, at least involuntary manslaughter.
I try to apply the NRA and gun fetishist logic to these shootings to see how would what they say are the solutions to gun problems apply here. You need a good guy with a gun to stop a bad guy with a gun. The 9-month-old, did the 9-month-old need a gun, or was it the mom that needed a gun to be able to go in and shoot the 5-year-old before he shot the 9-month-old? We need to be training kids in gun safety is another one that we hear. Should there be a mandatory class for 4-year-olds so that when this 4-year-old turned 5, he would already have a year of gun safety experience under his belt? Is that the solution? People need guns to defend themselves. Who? The 9-month-old? Or what's the other one that we hear? Guns don't kill people. People kill people. Okay, so then what do we do to the 5-year-old who killed a person, right? I never see in all of these cases how any of the right-wing gun fetishist logic would improve the circumstances.
No, and I all these people keep guns under their pillows, under their beds, in close proximity to them, and chances are most of those people will never need to pick up and use that gun in an emergency situation in their entire lives.
Statistically speaking, that's true, although that doesn't say that there aren't defensive uses of guns. Of course there are.
Of course, but I would say that unless you are, in a high-risk area or a high-risk individual and you have other people in the house, kids moving around the house, just don't do it. Just keep it in a safe unless you consider yourself at higher risk than the average person.
A lot of consternation as new police radars can sort of see inside homes. There are at least 50 new U.S. law enforcement agencies. Let me say that a different way. There are 50 U.S. law enforcement agencies that have purchased these new radars and have equipped officers with them, and it effectively allows looking through walls of homes to see whether anyone is inside, which is bringing up huge legal questions when it comes to government surveillance. These agencies include the FBI and the U.S. Marshals Service. They started deploying the radar systems 2 years ago. No notice given to courts, no public disclosure of when or how those systems would be used. And the radars work sort of like motion detectors. They use radio waves to zero in on movement as slight as human breathing from a distance of more than 50 feet. And they can detect whether people are inside of a house, where they are, whether they're moving, what they're doing. And there, of course, is the I guess we would call it the expected refrain from law enforcement officials that this just helps to keep officers safe. However, we may already have a court case that tells us about the legality of this. Under Kelo versus the U.S., if you read the description of that case, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that thermal imaging of Kelo's home, the individual involved in that case, constituted a search. Since the police did not have a warrant when they used the device, which was not commonly available to the public, the search was presumptively unreasonable and therefore unconstitutional. Even Justice Antonin Scalia asserted that there is a difference between off-the-wall surveillance and through-the-wall surveillance, and that the difference was essentially non-existent with the use of these devices because both methods physically intrude upon the privacy of the homes. Scalia created a firm but bright line drawn by the Fourth Amendment at the entrance of the house. Lewis, even Scalia thinks that this is wrong.
Well, I think there is one key difference here. The thermal imaging actually gives you a visual picture of what's happening inside the house, whereas I don't think that this device does, but they still essentially are accomplishing the same thing.
Well, the question would be whether this is constituting a search of inside the home. And
Right.
I would say, whatever the specifics of the device are, if you can determine where people are, whether they're moving and what they're doing, you are searching the inside of that home, regardless of how precise or detailed the image you get is.
Perhaps if an officer puts his or her ear up to the door or to a window, does that accomplish the same thing?
Again, I believe that if the window has no blinds and there is just an officer looking in, that is not a search per se, because there is no entry going on behind what is presumed to be, if you don't have a blind down over your window, that's a different situation. I think if you put your ear up to the door, I don't believe that is the same type of search as thermal imaging or radar imaging. I think that there's a difference there.
I think there's going to be some gray area here. I think this is going to be an interesting discussion. Curious to see what happens.
All right. I have some emails responding to yesterday's discussion of the film American Sniper. A lot of email responding to what we had to say about the film. Here is one email. Chris Kyle is no hero. He's a xenophobic psychopath who joined the military so he could get away with murder. It happens more often than you might imagine. Another one who very much disagreed. I want to send all of these piece of S liberals to Iraq and Afghanistan. They'll be begging for someone like Chris Kyle to save their pathetic asses. Another one. Chris Kyle openly admitted that he shot and killed U.S. citizens during the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Chris Kyle lied and defamed former veteran Navy SEAL and Governor Jesse Ventura, claiming that he punched Ventura for making disparaging remarks about U.S. troops. This was proven to be a lie, for which Ventura won a lawsuit. Chris Kyle is no American hero. Another person responding to our commentary saying, Muslims are vermin, kill all the ragheads. And then lastly, F you, Pac-Man, faggots, support the American troops, and God bless America. So the response to our segment, Lewis, really running the gamut.
Yep, it sounds just like what we've been reading online. A lot of patriotism and a lot of patriotism.
On today's bonus show, a new hydrophobic medal. Greenpeace hands over the names of their criminal activists, and much more. Lewis is the host of the bonus show. I am the sidekick. And you can get instant access to the bonus show and all other great member benefits by becoming a member today at davidpakman.com/membership. We could not do this show without our members. So if you like this show, if you've come to take it for granted that we just put the show out every day and it's available, it is because of member support. If you have the financial means, I would ask you to consider doing your part to support the work we're doing. That's davidpakman.com/membership.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.